This is Viva Fry.
I'm Dr. Peter McCullough.
This is Tom Luongo.
This is Chuck Prodnick.
This is Alex Kreiner.
Hey, this is Brad Wall.
This is JP Sears.
Hi, this is Frank Peretti.
This is Tammy Peterson.
This is Danielle Smith.
This is James Lindsay.
Hey, this is Brett Kissel, and you're listening to the Sean Newman Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast, folks. How's everybody doing today? Happy Thursday. Let's start with a little Silver Gold Bull, shall we? Well, I'm just on silvergoldbull.ca looking at the charts, and gold had hit a high of $6,083.19 back on October 16th. That's Canadian dollars, folks. I know there's some listeners that do everything in American, but in Canadian, $63.80. It's dropped down slightly, back down to now $56.23 as it sits today. And if you go back a year ago, it was $37.94. So something to keep your eyes on. If you're looking to do any dealings in precious metals, Silver Gold Bull has a wide variety of best value silver for every budget. You can simply text or email Graham for details, whether you're a seasoned investor or new to precious metals. He'll work with you to answer your questions and recommend the best products to meet your investing goals, whether it's buying, selling, storing, or using your retirement accounts to invest in precious metals. Graham will have some answers. It's all down in the show notes. You can also visit them at silvergoldbull.ca or .com, depending on what side of the border you're on. And any purchase you make, just make sure to reference the Sean Newman Podcast. Guardian Plumbing and Heating. These guys have been keeping homes, farms, and businesses running smoothly since 2010. And Guardian's efficient grain dryers and Guardian power stations aren't just available here in Lloydminster. They're available all across Canada. The power station is an absolute game changer, giving you 2-for-1 utilities, heat, and electricity from the same reliable system. It's an innovative way to keep your operation running efficiently and save on energy costs. So whether it's expert service, cutting-edge power solutions, or advice you can trust, Guardian Plumbing and Heating has your back. You can find them at guardianplumbing.ca. Ignite Distribution is a high-service supply company based in Wainwright, Alberta, specializing in automotive parts and a wide range of additional products, including safety equipment, welding supplies, fasteners, and janitorial items. They operate as a Napa Auto Parts retailer, and you can reach out to them, 780-842-3433. Say hello to Shane Stafford and his team. They are certainly one of the best out there. Quick Dick McDick Live, November 22nd. Man, that is coming awfully quick here. Just weeks away now, and you can get tickets at showpass.com/Lashburn. I keep saying /Lashburn. All the proceeds going to a new playground for the Lashburn Elementary School, and you can find tickets once again, showpass.com/Lashburn. The MASH Spiel is happening January 17th in Kalmar, just west of Leduc. So just a little ways outside the International Airport in Edmonton. We have under 12 teams available. You can sign up as an individual or a group of 4, and it's just going to be a mashup community event. So that should be fun. Don't worry if you're not a curler. I certainly am not, and you'll be right at home with me. No worries there. The Cornerstone. Ooh, spit it out. The Cornerstone Forum returns March 28th. 2026, and we've got some returnees: Tom Luongo, Alex Kreiner, Matt Arrett, Tom Bodrovics. Tooze is going to be reprising a role, and then we got some newcomers: Vince Lanchi, who was supposed to be at this year's Cornerstone, but he had health problems. He's going to be making it out this year. Chad Prather, Karen Kostowski. Oh, spit it out, Sean. Holy Mackinac. Feels like a Monday on this side, folks. The names don't want to come. We got a Friday night social that's free to attend if you're buying a ticket for the Cornerstone Forum, so make sure you sign up for that. You can find all the details down in the show notes, showpass.com/Cornerstone26. And looking forward to seeing all you fine folks there again. We got some different topics that are going to be brought up this year, and we're going to be unveiling those hopefully sooner than later. We're just confirming a few more guests, obviously, and as we confirm those, we'll be announcing as well. You can sign up for Substack. It's free to subscribe to. Sundays, the Week in Review gives you a snapshot of what happened through the week on the podcast. You can also become a paid member and support the SMP and get a little behind-the-scenes action. If you're listening or watching on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, make sure to subscribe. Make sure to leave a review. Make sure to share with a friend if you're enjoying the show. All right, let's get on to that tale of the tape. Today's guest spent 40-plus years as a journalist, reporting from over 70 countries and a dozen wars. He served as Chief Foreign Correspondent for the Washington Times. I'm talking about Martin Sieff. So buckle up. Here we go. Welcome to the Sean Newman Podcast. Today I'm joined by Martin Sieff. Marty, thanks for hopping on.
My great pleasure, Sean.
Now, it's your first time on the podcast, so if you wouldn't mind, maybe just a little bit of your background. It's quite extensive, but wherever you want to take us, just so the audience knows who they're listening to.
Sure. I'm from the very, very lower middle class of the streets of Belfast, which I was raised, and thanks to the enterprise of my dad, I was propelled into a wonderful school in Belfast, far beyond our socioeconomic background at the time, very modest background. And my school then propelled me into Oxford University. I took 2 degrees in modern history at Oxford University, and then did graduate work in Middle East studies, which took me around Israel, Palestine, Egypt, primarily, in my late 20s. But only then I found my real calling, which is the news business. So I spent 5 years in different newspapers in Belfast, and that led me to stringing for a then new and disreputable outfit, because it was a new conservative newspaper in Washington, D.C., the Washington Times. And they could get no one respectable or experienced at first to work for them in Washington. And I very much wanted to come to America. I'd already been over in the East Coast, loved it, had a girlfriend over there. And the irony is when I came over, I got involved with someone else, married her, stayed put. But I was in Washington journalism for 36 years. First of all, 13 years with the Washington Times. I was their Eastern European and Soviet affairs editor and chief analyst. Then as chief news analyst and managing editor at United Press International. And finally, after that, I spent, as we discussed, 3 years in Kazakhstan helping set up, I don't even know if it's still running now, it may not be, or under different names, an English language energy newswire or news service covering energy developments in the Caspian Basin, which is, of course, now ranking along with Alberta as one of the great energy growth areas of the world. So, especially at my advanced stage by that point, that was a very interesting thing. Then I came back to Washington, D.C. and to Bethesda, and spent another 10 years working for European news agencies as an analyst on Washington. I became a Trump expert because I'd actually predicted Trump's victory in 2016 when nobody else had, which is a story in itself. And I've got 7 books published so far, 2 more completed that I'm looking for publishers for. And as we discussed, my next project, I hope, is going to be the book is going to be called An Energy Map of the World in the Year 2050, which of course is very relevant to the policies and prosperity of the state of Alberta, which, given half a chance, should have a very prosperous quarter century, if I am right.
Well, before we get to energy, you talk about being a correspondent on Russia or Soviet Russia. Did you see where we're at here in 2025 happening the way it's played out here through Biden and now Trump? Forgive me, maybe I'm reading not. Maybe you could clarify, I guess. Like, how much time have you spent around Russia or Soviet Union or both? Did your reporting, your journalism take you there or that area a lot?
A very great deal, absolutely. I came on board the Washington Times in beginning of 1986, January 1986, and I'm now also writing my memoirs. And there's a bit of analysis in them, but mainly they're strong on gossip and the kind of tall but true stories that in the news business you tend to come across or live yourselves, as I was privileged to do. And within 2 weeks of me coming on board at the Washington Times, they'd given me the crown jewels. They put me in charge of directing and building from scratch their coverage of the Soviet Union. And a month after they gave me that job, the 27th Party Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, CPSU, began in Moscow. And Mikhail Gorbachev ended 33 years of stagnation since the death of Joseph Stalin and launched the policies of glasnost and perestroika, of openness and restructuring. And everything changed. And I was there at the very beginning of it. I have 3 Pulitzer Prize nominations for international reporting. The first 2 of them were I got, or were awarded to me, for covering the collapse of communism, first in Eastern Europe, and the following year in the Soviet Union itself. I was never officially based in the Soviet Union, but I was often over there for 1 to 3 months at a time, traveled extensively over there. I've traveled the length of the Trans-Siberian Railway, among other things. And I covered the disintegration of the glasnost process because Gorbachev didn't have a clue, and which led directly to the disintegration, of course, of the Soviet Union. And then I covered the dark years under Yeltsin, when the country was pillaged by its own oligarchs and Western capitalist greed, which couldn't look for even to the end of their own noses, participated in it. So they turned an inherently strongly pro-Western and pro-America admiring Russian people, as they had been under Gorbachev, into a very, ultimately, it took a long time, but ultimately into a very suspicious Russian people, which underlines what we see today. So I didn't, predict boldly in advance in every detail, or any detail. I didn't have a crystal ball what was to come, but I was following it and monitoring it at every stage and seeing it steadily getting worse. And of course, one of the biggest lies and myths about Russia is that they were happy and democratic under Yeltsin, which was the darkest era they had suffered since Stalin, not because Yeltsin was a Stalin, but because he was a drunken, corrupt, incompetent, and at least 20 million people, Russian estimates were much higher, died simply, especially the old and the very young, of hardship, because not a single state salary was paid for most of those 7 or 8 years. And the reason Vladimir Putin is fundamentally secure, despite all the lies thrown out about him, and he's not a Democrat, he's not a liberal, he's not a peacenik. A lot of idiocy is talked about this. Of course he isn't. He's a very dangerous man if you cross him. But there is a social contract he has with the Russian people, because he raised the Russian people to the highest standard of living consistently over the past 25 years that they have ever enjoyed. And this is never mentioned or acknowledged in the West, and it is crucial to dealing with Russia.
Okay, you rattled off a lot there.
That's my problem. I mean, it really is my problem. And
No. So I want to go back a little bit.
Sure.
You mentioned you were there essentially at the late 80s and for a whole chunk of time after that.
Yes.
You said something along the lines of the disintegration of and I want to say it was something like the Glasnost process, but I probably butchered that word.
Glasnost. No, you're fine. Absolutely. Yes.
What is that? What do you mean? But what is that?
Mikhail Gorbachev thought he could preserve the Soviet Union and renew it by liberalizing it with a small L, by removing the secret police, by removing censorship, by removing any even background aspect of terror, which was a lot less under Brezhnev and Khrushchev than it had ever been under the monstrous Stalin. But of course it was still there, and you felt it. I was first there after Brezhnev died under his successor Chernenko way back in 1983. And you felt the oppression. You could cut it with a knife. Same in Germany.
When you say you felt it, could you paint me a picture? You're riding around the train. Like, what was it that you felt or saw?
You felt that there was no secret about this. You were in a totalitarian state, and you could not go anywhere, and everything you said was watched closely and monitored, and you knew it. And Russian people could not talk freely to visiting Americans or Germans or Brits or anyone else, because the security organs were watching them. All the cliches which it's now fashionable to sneer about Soviet and communist tyranny were literally true. You cannot have a Soviet system, whether it's in Russia or China under Mao, which is much more open now, of course, too. Another story, or in North Korea, where it's still as bad as you can possibly imagine. You cannot have communism anywhere without total repression And completely. There's a wonderful German movie called The Lives of Others about how the Stasi, the East German secret police, basically watched everyone, and basically half the people you knew were informers, and you often, even to do the kind of thing you and I are doing now, if they would have let it, we would have had to be informers ourselves. Every priest in the Orthodox Church until the end of communism was also an officer of the KGB. You could not be a priest without being an officer in the secret police. That's how deep it went.
So then if you look over the past 20 some years, no, it's closing in on 30 years, I guess.
Sure.
Closing in on 30 years since the Soviet Union fell. Right? I'm doing my math here. I don't know why this is stumping me this morning.
Oh, no. I can do it because it's in the marrow of my bones. And, I was covering it when it happened. 1990, 91, so about 35 years. I mean, I'm old, and it's still nearly half my lifetime.
So one of the things that I've been very interested in, as I do this show more and more, it's like, how long does it take for a group of people, the culture, to want something different? And so you get out of Soviet Russia and you bring in a guy that's going to bring in the little L. And I'm sure that sounded great. We're going to get rid of this secret police. Things are going to be better. We're going to talk to one another. It's going to be great. So they let and forgive me because you'll know this way better than I will. So then they let the Americans in and they start pilfering all the countryside of the resources. And they go, oh, wait. But now we get to talk about this and we're not going to talk about that. Maybe you can walk me through the first 10 to 15 years of getting away from the Soviet Union, the KGB, all the organs staring at everything, everybody being an informant. There had to have been a little bit of a grace period or a time where it almost felt like it was getting better. But then you started staring at the problems again.
No, it never got better. That's the thing. Under Yeltsin, it was a catastrophe from the word go, and it kept crashing. I've lectured a lot over the past 25 years around the US. And I've been on lecture circuits not for the army, but I'm too much of a heretic on tactics for them, but for the US Navy and the US Air Force. And often there are senior officers in the audience. And one line I always brought up that I found stopped people in their tracks. I would throw them a question. Do you know what the Great Depression in the United States, in Canada too, of course, smelled like? Think about that. Everybody knows what it sounds like because there's this fabulous music and we still listen to it. Everybody knows what it looked like because there were so many fabulous Hollywood gangster movies. Or classics like the Grapes of Wrath by John Ford that were made even in the 1930s. And about it, since then, have recreated. We all know what it looked like, what it sounded like. What did it smell like? And then I say, I know, I can tell you. It must have smelled exactly the same way the Soviet Union cities, including Moscow, smelled in the 1990s. And apologies for the more sensitive members of your audience here. It smelled like piss. It smelled like urine. Urine saturated everything because everybody peed in public, because every public lavatory and even bathrooms in outside luxury hotels where they were still passable. But outside that, every public bathroom was indescribably filthy, and people were exhausted and starving and demoralized and in deep depression. Literally psychological as well as economic. And so they peed everywhere. So wherever you went, everything smelled of urine. It saturated everything. And that is the way the Great Depression in the United States must have felt like too. When I was younger, even 25 years ago, there were still a surprising number of people who were very old, in America, of course, who you came across who'd lived through this. And I would ask them, because I was back from trips to Moscow, what did it smell like? And yeah, they said, yes, that's the way exactly it smelled. And that saturated everything. There was corruption and incompetence from the beginning in Yeltsin. The worst elements in the Communist Party took over and the gangsters took over. So it wasn't just the West raping them. Their own underworld raped them. And of course, they had eager supporters in the name of democracy and free markets, of course. Because one thing, when we do neo-imperialism, we always, God help us, have to feel moral and upright about it. It's the same as with the massacre of the Ukrainian people when they're being manipulated by deep state elements in Britain and the United States today. It's not bad enough that we send 1.7 million to 1.8 million Ukrainians to their deaths. We have to do it with the big lie that we're being as heroic as Winston Churchill was in the 1930s, just as he stood up to Hitler, we're standing up to Vladimir Putin. But people die as a result of this. Millions of people die as a result of this. Even now, I am losing, and I lose no sleep over it. I'm proud of it. I am losing and turning my back on close friends over the past 30 and 40 years of my life who call me a Russian shill, or I'm too much of a champion of Trump because I'm championing democracy too much. No, he's destroying democracy. He's worse than Lenin and Stalin and Hitler combined. Nonsense like that. And I'm also clashing with people who worship President Trump wildly, which you should not do, because that is what you do with people like Stalin and Hitler and what have you. You have to be able to stand back. And I mean, one has to have a nuanced view towards President Putin. He has raised the standard of living of the Russian people to a greater level than ever before. In the past, he has shown no interest in trying to conquer or subvert all of Western Europe, which he easily has the resources to do. But he's not a man, precisely for those reasons. He is not a man to underestimate or to take lightly. And this is where my Northern Irish background kicks back in. And that is, I spent 6 years in Belfast newsrooms, and I wasn't an eminent figure. I was at the bottom of the heap. I was a copy desk editor, and later on, slightly higher, I was a desk editor handling the copy of outstanding and very courageous reporters investigating the terrorist underground movements, and they weren't underground, they were very overt in Northern Ireland at the time. And one thing we all knew and learned and practiced was when you are up against people who are murderers and torturers and they have power and the law cannot touch them because the law has broken down, be polite to them. Don't make needless enemies of them. You don't want to be in their pocket. You don't want to be close to them. But you smile and you try and keep your integrity and you try and keep, above all else, your distance. But if you have to deal with them, you deal with them as honestly as you can and with respect. And that's what we have to do with Russia and China, because these are thermonuclear powers. They aren't Hitler, they aren't Stalin, they aren't Mao. But they have much more power than Mao or Stalin ever had in their dreams, because they have thermonuclear weapons and the delivery systems to carry them. So I advocate careful and respectful coexistence. Doesn't mean you give away the farm and give everything away or trust wildly. But this fake macho posturing, especially under Biden and the Democrats, and this English love of fake moral superiority, they pillaged the world, including Canada, for hundreds of years. Pillaged the world. I mean, I'm Irish, right? They pillaged the world. But they're so moral and liberal, and they love to wag the little finger at you and me, don't they? And how horrible it is that the Prime Minister of Alberta presumes to treat energy superpowers like Russia and China with respect. How dare he? There's a great Lebanese, I'm sure you're very familiar with him, a great Lebanese analyst who lives most of his life in New York, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And he wrote a book called Skin in the Game. And he makes the point that if you don't have skin in the game, if you're, what's the word? If you aren't directly involved, don't have interest either with the safety of your own life or your family's life and your prosperity, or you're not risking your own fortune or your own well-being committed to a political or economic idea, why on earth should anyone listen to you? Why should they listen to you? And that's the point about all the talking heads talking in Washington and London and propelling us into thermonuclear confrontation with Russia. They think they don't have skin in the game. Actually, they do, because they will be annihilated like the rest of us with thermonuclear destruction. Where you are in Alberta is an ideal place to be. If you can get me out there, even as a visiting lecturer, do so. Because I'd love to get, at my advanced stage, I'd love to get, if not myself, at least my kids and my wife out there for an extended period of time. It would be nice, because every major civilization city in North America and Western Europe will be under threat of literal destruction if it comes to thermonuclear war with Russia. And we have broken every sober guarantee. And I was there when they were all made. I covered them for the Washington Times as their State Department correspondent and as their Soviet and Eastern Affairs editor-in-chief analyst before that. For 13 years at the Washington Times, every commitment we made and promised that we would never try to disassemble Russia, that we would never bring any former Warsaw Pact nation into NATO, has been ignored. The two presidents who made those pledges did not break them. I think they were largely sincere in making them. That was President Ronald Reagan and President George Herbert Walker Bush. And at first, President Bill Clinton felt very strongly the same way. But the world changed, and they listened to people who had a racist hatred of Russia like poison, including two very powerful figures in America, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the chief guru on foreign policy of the Democratic Party for 50 years till he died. And the other was his own chosen figure to become Secretary of State, and that was Madeleine Albright. And between the two of them, they molded Hillary Clinton, who shared these views, and Barack Obama, who knew nothing about foreign policy, but had been recommended to David Rockefeller as a future president of the United States when he was still studying at Columbia University. He only took a single course in international affairs at Columbia. But who was his teacher? Who was his lecturer? Professor Brzezinski, who I knew very well. And I had a very ironical relationship with Zbig, because in my first 7 years in Washington, he loved me, because I was more forthright and outspoken that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, which is what he wanted to hear and which no one else was saying in the media at the time. There were experts saying it, and I was propelled by my own brilliant editor-in-chief at the time, Arno de Borgraaf, to those people. And that's how I learned it. And then I went there and saw what was happening for myself with my own eyes. And by the way, that's crucial too to being a reporter, to go to places and see what's actually happening with your own eyes and to register it. And nobody seems to be doing this anymore. And it's except for a few people who are still there. My friend John Helmer, remarkable man, actually worked for Jimmy Carter back in the 1970s. We would have been political arch opponents then. But his work from Moscow over the past 20, 25 years has been outstanding. He's honest and he's brave. And he just listening to him will give you a corrective. Or listening to, from the other side of the fence, to Colonel Douglas MacGregor, extraordinary man. He's actually the American de Gaulle. Like de Gaulle, a brilliant leader in battle in 1991, and like de Gaulle became one of the leading theoreticians of new revolutionary ways of waging conventional war in major books that he wrote. De Gaulle did this in the 1920s and 1930s. And Colonel MacGregor has been doing it for the past 20 years. And he has been warning all along that we were sending the Ukrainian people to their doom, to their slaughter, propelling them into a war against Russia they didn't have a chance of winning, and that the Russians regarded as essential and existential for their survival.
Before I go back to Russia, because I got a couple more on there
Oh,
that
sure.
you're spurring up, but you hit on a thought that I've been thinking a lot about. I've been doing this podcast now for a little over 6 years. Now, certainly on these topics, everybody knows who's been following along. It's been about 4 since 2021. The podcast really shifted its direction and trying to understand different things in the world. But you said journalists aren't traveling to the places because you need to go see and experience and talk to the people. I've been thinking a lot about this. I have people come on, no different than yourself, tell me things, and I walk away and I go, but how can I totally believe everything Martin said? And that it goes for every guest that comes on here, Martin. It's not just you. I go, the only way to truly know is to go see it.
Yeah.
Is to actually go to these places and talk to the people and start to see with your own eyes what's actually happening. Because what newspapers or podcasters or anything, you built this realm without actually ever stepping foot on the soil, interacting with the people.
Exactly.
And so then if all you do is read paper, oh, it's really bad over there. It's really bad. Yeah, it's really bad. But you actually don't know. I mean, you kind of do, but you don't.
You're absolutely right. I was at a conference in 2014 in Moscow for U.S. Russian bridge building at the time, and it was organized by a friend of mine who died just earlier this year. A wonderful man of the greatest stature, legendary figure himself, the late Professor Edward Lazansky, who had been a Soviet nuclear physicist and had then been persecuted by the KGB because, like Sakharov, who he had studied under and they were close friends, he became a true believer in democracy and the evils of the communist system. So he was kicked out. And Republican presidents and vice presidents loved him. Dick Cheney, who just died today, I think became a very sinister figure. But Ed had warm memories of him because Cheney had brought him in. And when Cheney was Secretary of Defense already under the first Bush administration, the older President Bush, he had Ed in to actually, again, he wanted to hear what life was like at first hand, not just reading about it in books. And of course, when you read books, and I've read my share, and you go there and you find two things. You find, oh, all these books are written by assholes who don't know the F-U-C-K, what they're talking about, right? But then you also find, my God, X, Y, and Z got it completely right. Russians love George Orwell. And they used to ask, certainly, maybe he's more out of fashion now because Russia, even under Putin, is much more open than it ever was under the communists, which again, you never hear. But in the communist era, especially and after it, in the generational change and the openness that followed, people would always say rhetorically, and in conversation it came up again and again, how George Orwell was an Englishman in a relatively free country. He always was able to say what he wanted. And he was very much anti-imperialist in this time too. He loathed the British Empire because he'd served it. He found it vile, which is never discussed today, but he found it vile. But Orwell, in 1984, and Animal Farm, completely recreated every totalitarian state, what they're like, the corruption, the misery, the despair, the fear, the knowledge that every move you make, every twitch of your fingernail is being closely watched. I mentioned Professor Lazansky before, who became a dissident against American fascism and American totalitarianism long before he died. A decade before he died, back in 2014 or thereabouts. Yeah, 2014. It was June 2014, I even remember that. I dropped by his apartment where he and a beautiful and brilliant wife, Tatiana, a remarkable lady herself, were living at the time. Their kids had grown, so they were, in a, what's the word, after the kids have grown, you downsize for comfort. And they were living in this very pleasant apartment near the Van Ness Metro in Washington, D.C. And we were having a morning coffee. And Eddie said to me something that I'd already known him for decades at that point. We'd been on the Washington Times at the same time. And he said to me, Marty, the Americans are turning their own country into the Soviet Union, and they don't even realize they're doing it. And that was one of the scariest things I have ever heard in my life. I felt, as they say metaphorically, the prickles on my spine rise, because I'd known Eddie for 30 years almost at that point. And I revered him, and still do. And it just, sometimes somebody will say something, just a phrase, this. It'll hit you in the solar plexus, or bong, right at your third eye, at the pineal gland, bong. And, it's not physical, it's only psychological, it's mental. But the idea, the shock, the realization stops you cold in your tracks. And that's what that did when he said that, because it has been going in that direction ever since. There is more independence of thought, not in the televised media. The Russian government takes very care to monitor that, regulate it very carefully. But even there, there's still the internet, and there's still some dissidence. But if you look at the print newspapers that openly operate in Moscow, in Russian as well as in English, there's much more criticism of policies in Ukraine and of Putin than there ever was of Biden's ghastly policies here in America. Under President Trump, of course, it's the opposite. There have been efforts by the so-called mainstream media, as you well know, to delegitimize President Trump since 2016. And by that point, I was also already at technical retirement age. I was over 65, and I'd been in the news business for nearly 30 years at that point when Trump took office, right? 30 years, in fact. And I still couldn't believe what I was seeing. I kept thinking, this cannot be happening in America. It cannot be happening in Britain. In Britain, you still have, 8, 9, 10 newspapers operating, left, right, pro-labor, pro-conservative, this, that, and the other. But on the fundamental issues, that Trump is evil and must be gotten rid of, or that Putin is worse than Hitler, or that we are justified in going after Ukraine and recolonizing it and re-enslaving it the way we did to China, which is literally what they're trying to do. What they did to China in 1840 for 100 years, they are trying to do to Ukraine for the next 100 years. Britain has actually signed a literal 100-year treaty with Ukraine, which the Ukrainians have leaked, of course. And it includes secret protocols under which Britain will be given full control of customs, excise, and overtaxation collection in Ukraine. What happens to Ukrainian sovereignty after that? What happens to Ukrainian freedom? What happens to Ukrainian prosperity? It'll be if it never happens, and it won't happen. It's mission impossible. It's a delusional dream by the British deep state and government and the City of London. Delusional dream. It cannot happen. It will not be allowed to happen by the Russians or the Chinese or even the Germans and the democratic Western Europeans in their own way, because simply they have, not out of idealism, but because out of their own interests. And Britain doesn't have the clout to impose this kind of slavery on Ukraine the way they did on the Chinese people for 100 years. And I'm beginning to learn you have your own stories to tell in Canada. It was done the British way, much more discreetly. The people who suffered were primarily not white people coming in, because what's the population of Canada today? 40 million?
40 million.
Yeah. And, 30, 40 years ago, it had been only half that. Canada is huge. So, for white immigrants coming in, I think by and large it was much better in Canada than it was for the first generation of any immigrant group who ever came into the United States, because the population pressure and competition for resources, so much less. But if you look at, as you know, the very dark stories that have emerged about the persecution and sexual exploitation and pillaging of lands of the first nation peoples of North America, of Canada especially, it's shocking. And as you know, there are still scandals about this coming out on a regular basis. And our mutual friend Matt Ehred and his amazing wife Cynthia Chung, as we both know, have been doing heroic work over the years in helping get those stories out to the public as they ought to be. But this is what the British deep, not the British people, which is different, but the British deep state has in mind for Ukraine. And they've already been explicit about it. 100-year treaty? What does that mean? It means exploitation. It means empire. It means colonialism. It doesn't mean protection and respect. It took Canada 150 years under the British Empire, from the 7 Years' War up to the 1920s, to win effective independent status by the early 1920s. And look at the number of dead Canadians who died on Vimy Ridge and on the Western Front because of the bungles of the British Empire before that. Sorry, go ahead.
I've been toying with this question because I get told I'm too much of an optimist, and it's not the way the world works. And I look at this guy and you, Marty, and you've been all over the world covering all the different tyrannical regimes. Is kind of what I hear, and I don't mean to silo you off, but you've stared at a lot of different governments and how they work. And I'm like, it's not that I'm an eternal optimist that, I think there's this utopian world where we all just get along to get along. But at the same token, that you mentioned a word earlier with Russia just wanting to coexist. I think that's how it was said, but just basically, or maybe that the U.S. should just allow, like, we could just coexist. Is that an impossible thought? Right?
No, no,
Can we just coexist like Russia? Because when I look at Russia, if I'm wrong on this, please point out something different. You got Stalin and the Soviet Russia. They go Soviet Union. You go through like these atrocious years. I don't think any listener can go, oh no, Soviet Union wasn't that bad. It's like, no, it was pretty bad.
yeah,
And then you get to the fall of the Soviet Union, and you get Yeltsin, and you're saying Yeltsin was by far as bad as any of the dark years of Stalin. You're talking about it's smelling like urine everywhere you went. It's just despair. They're impoverished. It's just everything. And it gives rise then to Putin. Putin
yes,
walks in and is he a good man? No, he's a pretty dangerous man. He's done some things. But what did he do for the Russian people who he
exactly.
serves? He brought them out of the gutter. And so when you're sitting here on this side, I go, okay, you can love or hate Putin, but the people that live there, you're telling me he has given them a better life.
Yes,
And any leader that gives people a better life, all of a sudden they're going to follow that guy a lot farther than a guy who's taken everything they have and they can't put food on the table and kids are dying, the elderly are dying, everybody's dying, life sucks. Everywhere you go, it stinks, on and on and on the things go. So it gives me a good mindset of like, okay, you can sit and hate Putin all you want, but the Russian people, by and large, can remember a dark time under Yeltsin. And they're going to be sharing those stories for years to come because they're still alive. So that's what's motivating your enemy right now, right? In the West, we have this enemy. It's Putin. It's Russia. We got to get rid of them. And I'm like, well, is there this? I'm not like this crazy optimist guy where we're all going to hold hands and walk around, but coexist sounds pretty nice right now. When you're talking about going to nuclear war or whatever this war looks like, I'm like, why would we do that? Why can't we just coexist? Putin isn't, as far as I know, isn't landing on Canadian soil and trying to round up every Ukrainian to send him back there. He doesn't, like, I haven't seen that. But this coexist thing, to me, it's like, well, can we get there? Like, is that even possible?
it should be. We've had it before. We should have it again. I know personally people, bless them, when they're still around in their 70s, their 80s. One very eminent name comes to mind, and that is Raymond McGovern, who is now in his 80s, veteran CIA analyst, outstanding. He personally briefed at least 4 Republican presidents on Russia. And they were specifically Richard Nixon. He goes all the way back to that. And then also Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and the elder and vastly superior of the 2 Bushes, president of the very dangerous and formidable man himself, not to be taken lightly, which people do, George Herbert Walker Bush. He briefed them all. And he has been, for at least the last 25 years, an outspoken critic, one of the leading critics of our insane policies towards Russia. And he is a successful prophet, and there are many others like him. They predicted what was going to happen. You are not preventing a new Cold War. You will not succeed in breaking up Russia. All you will succeed in doing is radicalizing Russia, an entire generation of Russian people, against the West. I had a friend, I'd known from my Middle East years, many years ago. I won't mention him by name. He might take a legal action against me. But I broke off with him after nearly half a century because in a chat group we were both involved with, and he isn't in the United States. He was originally Canadian, God help us, but he hasn't been back in Canada in decades. And he insisted in giving his solution for the world crisis. Assassinate President Trump, God forbid, and assassinate President Putin, God forbid. And I say God forbid in Putin's case, because whoever took over in such a case would be much more likely to press the thermonuclear button even than Putin would. And I think Putin is perfectly capable of doing it. He is. I was given, this is more than 30 years ago, I mean, I'd be on the other side of the fence from them now, but I was given access back into the early 1990s into the British intelligence services assessment, psychological assessment of Boris Yeltsin when he took office. And it was a very frightening assessment. The assessment was, yes, he is pro-Western. Yes, he wants détente. Yes, he is liberalizing the economy as we want him to. Yes, he is in favor of democracy, at least in the abstract. He wasn't in reality. He sent tanks to shell the parliamentary building, the White House was then held in Moscow, on the Moscow, just looking out over the Moscow River, when Parliament was still in session. That's how much of a Democrat he turned out to be. Bill Clinton and his people openly boasted, and there were Time magazine cover stories on this, that they fixed this 1996 election. They manipulated it so that Yeltsin would win when most of the Russian people already loathed and hated him. We were manipulating so-called free democratic elections in Moscow, in Russia, in all of Russia, before we ever were doing it to ourselves in the United States. That's horrific. But the psychological assessment that the Brits came up with, I was told, in 1991, I was briefed, was that with all the good things we see about Yeltsin, he's a very dangerous man. He's an alcoholic, even by Russian standards. He's often out of control because of his booze. I covered him both in Russia, but also when he came around America before he became president of Russia in, I think, it was 1980, sometime in late 1989, or the summer of fall of 1989. You can look it up. He goes around the United States, and wherever he went, sometimes he even missed appointments of major speeches because he was too drunk. But not just on vodka. He discovered Jack Daniel's whiskey, which was the great passionate love of the rest of Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin's life. Discovering Jack Daniel's bourbon. Do you see that in any of the assessments of him? But the British assessment of him was this. He's so uncontrollable and volatile and drunk in public that he's a much more dangerous threat than anyone since Khrushchev to actually press the thermonuclear button. Now, Putin up to now has been much less of a threat in that fundamental area. But could he press the button? And has he already approved a surprise preemptive strike on us? He may have done. If he hasn't done, he could easily do so. Because not just him, but the entire Russian establishment feels we have pushed them into an existential corner. And no wonder. We have people like Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. How can the idiots in Connecticut keep re-electing this dangerous psychopath who openly boasts that we are draining a Russian people dry of blood, of their young people, and that's why we have to keep feeding the Ukrainians weapons, because the Ukrainians are killing Russians for us. We didn't have that kind of talk. I'm old enough to remember. I lived through the entire Cold War. We never dared to talk that way about the Soviet Union, and even they never dared to talk about us in the United States and Canada that way, ever through the Cold War. Ever. And here is a United States senator openly in public boasting of it, and he's not alone. You hear it from so many of them, and all these wonderful, thoughtful think tank people. No. You are sending 300 million Americans and 330 million Americans and 40 million Canadians overwhelmingly to their deaths. That's what these evil, incompetent clowns are doing. I'm sorry. Again, I wandered off on my own tangents from what you were asking, but hopefully it's relevant and it's important.
I'm like there's the saying, strong men create good times, times create weak men create hard times, and I just I wonder if we're just how old are you then today, Marty?
75, 3/4 of a century.
Okay, so in your in your 75 years, does that saying hold weight? Does it carry water? Like
it's 100% true.
So then are we just at the time of weak men and we're going into hard times here?
Yes. And there's an irony to this. I think our strong people are already here, and you're one of them. And your wonderful Prime Minister in Alberta, she's another of them.
Yes, Premier,
thank you. Very good point. But nearly 40 years ago, my editor-in-chief, Arno de Borgraaf, saw me hiking down the road from the bus hiking toward the bus stop to go back downtown. The Washington Times building in those days was way in the outskirts of Washington. And I was already in his good books. He knew who I was. So he stops his chauffeur-driven stretch limo, very stretch limo. Arno was very much into conspicuous consumption, bless him. And, I'm riding with the great man. I'm riding with my top boss, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Times. So I'm young and I'm eager to impress. This is nearly 40 years ago. And I come up with what I think is a wonderful question for Arno. It's exactly what you just said, Sean. Why don't we produce great men anymore to lead us with wisdom? We had Harry Truman, we had Eisenhower, and actually there are a lot of negatives to be said truly about them, especially Eisenhower. Was a fraud from beginning to end. Or Henry Kissinger, who had more than a whiff of sulfuric darkness around him. And I was privileged to be a lunch and dinner guest with him over the years many times. And Henry was great company, a wonderful dinner companion, amazing wit, kept all his genius and brilliance, even to the age of 100. None of this was written for him. It was extemporary. He was extraordinary. And of course, there was the darkness too, but the brilliance and the vision and the competence were always there. So I said to Arno de Borgraaf nearly 40 years ago, why aren't we producing people like this anymore? I thought it was a profound question. He floored me with his answer, Sean. Oh, we're still producing them, Marty. They're all over the place. They're all over America. It's just here, and then he gave the punchline, the killer punch. It's just with our political system being so screwed up and all the corrupt interests around, the people who know what to do and would do it are never given a chance to do it. They're kept away from power and they're never elected to Congress either. And that stopped me in my tracks. And I was too young to fully appreciate what he was saying. And now, even now, I get more understanding of what he said then than I dreamed of even over the years since. Because it's this. You look at an idiotic, contemptible, ludicrous, pathetic, childish, pretentious TV piece of shit like The West Wing, which the British public in their wisdom voted the greatest television series of all time, better than Dickens, better than anything William Shakespeare or George Bernard Shaw ever wrote, better than anything. That's what they think. Oh, wow, it gives us a look into the appearance of what's really going on in the White House. And you have a president, played back very well by Martin Sheen, who is idealistic, who is decent, who never rapes interns the way Bill Clinton and many other American presidents did before and after him since. The Secret Service didn't expect to like Barack Obama. They didn't go for his policies. They didn't go for his liberalism. And he's not one of the guys. He was very snooty and very quiet and shy and reserved. But they came to their own surprise by and large. I was told by our White House correspondent at UPI to respect and admire him, even when they didn't vote for him or like him. But they respected him. Why? For two reasons. First, he had a warm family life with Michelle and his daughters, and he genuinely doted on his daughters. They weren't just photographic opportunities for him. First point. And secondly, he was meticulous, as George Bush Jr. was not, about paying many visits to American soldiers who had their limbs blown off in George W. Bush's endless, needless wars. Obama was meticulous in honoring the dead and showing compassion and tribute to the living who'd survived the needless wars that he did not end and did not dare to end, but had not initiated at least. You have to talk to people who actually have skin in the game, who have been on the spot, who have dealt with people. I mean, how do I know Madeleine Albright was not the great genius that she had to be as the First Lady, Secretary of State, and a nation of out-of-control feminism? You can have wonderful ladies like your Premier, not Prime Minister, Premier in Alberta, or Mrs. Margaret Thatcher, who was the most important and successful British Prime Minister in the 80 years since the end of World War II, love her or loathe her. But you can also have idiot incompetence taking over. And Madeleine Albright was one of those. Hillary Clinton falls into another more sinister and more competent category, but maybe that's a story for another time. But how do I know this about Madeleine Albright? Because I traveled with her with the U.S. Press Corps. I once almost accidentally vomited over her when she came over, to work the Washington Times, was making a point to me just at the time. And I'd had a night at a party in Moscow the night before, drinking quite literally limitless shots of vodka, but doing it the way the sensible Russians do it, with lots of food, so you absorb it when you're going on, so you're at least semi-conscious, and it doesn't put you into the emergency ward, as has happened to me on other occasions. So, but I wasn't a tipsy, still in a delicate state. And the sight of Mrs. Albright bending over me to make a point for the readers of the Washington Times was so ludicrous and appalling and idiotic that I nearly vomited over her. I nearly lost it, literally. And I kept thinking, what you said before, Sean, you've been all these wonderful places, you've covered all these wonderful stories, you've had all these wonderful scoops, but nobody will remember any of that. If you lose control of what's in your throat, you're only going to be remembered as the poor schnook who vomited over the First Lady Secretary of State of the United States. As you can see, I survived. I managed to hold it in. But sometimes the line in the U.S. Navy and aircraft carriers in World War II, senior officers said the line between being a hero and being a despised schnook and failure because of what you do or don't do, or order or don't order, in battle it can be as little as a couple of seconds or 12 seconds. Because, you only have that amount of time to make a snap call, and you can't know whether you're right or wrong. A lot of it is either pure instinct or the grace of God. And if you don't have the grace of God, look, I'm writing my memoirs at the moment, and I'm starting them not with, my life, which I've been in interesting places before I came to Washington, but when I came to Washington, when I was catapulted into all of this. And the first point I make is Napoleon was right and Margaret Thatcher was right. They both trusted in their luck. If I can tell one Thatcher and Russia-related story here, I was asked, I'd only been on the Washington Times 2 or 3 months before then. I was on nothing at the very bottom of the Belfast press. I wasn't a star of the Irish press. I was doing a most obscure drudge stuff possible, and I had dear friends who gave me work I liked doing, but it was very obscure. I got it just because they were my friends. And all of a sudden, here I am at the apex of Washington journalism. And my editor-in-chief asks me to brief Margaret Thatcher's private security advisor on Gorbachev. Now, I never met Gorbachev at this point. I'd done my due diligence. I'd done my homework on him, as I know you always do, as you even did on me. And I'd been covering him closely for just 2 or 3 months. But I had been covering him closely, very closely. So I said to this man, I can release his name now. He's dead, unfortunately, a number of years. He was very controversial, but to me, a very good man, but a very good friend, and a brilliant man. His name was David Hart, H-A-R-T. And I said to him, he asks, the great question, can we do business with him, with Gorbachev? And I said, well, they've not even given me the money to fly to Moscow yet. And in fact, the Russians wouldn't let anyone from the Washington Times in then or for another couple of years. Later it changed completely. But I'd looked at them closely, and I talked to the best Sovietologists in Washington, America, who were the best in the world in those days. And I said, yes, I can give you an assessment. You can do business with him. He's sincere. He's not a fake Stalin. He really wants to reform the system. But understand this, you can do business with him. But he isn't going to be here for that long. I was already saying that. Because he's hapless. He's unlucky. I don't know how else to describe it, I said. And all of a sudden, he seized on this. Oh, he said, unlucky is he. She'll want to know that. She's very lucky. And she knows it. And she trusts her luck. Now, in all the mountains of books and articles and commentaries I have seen on Margaret Thatcher, and you have seen your share too, I know. I've never seen that, have you? Anyone saying, oh, she's lucky, and she knows she's lucky, and she trusts her luck. That's supposed to be beneath the dignity of a great statesman. We're told great statesmen are chess players. Pretentious bags of shit like Zbig Brzezinski do play chess and take it seriously. So did the Soviet leaders, which is why there is no Soviet Union anymore. Because if you look at the great grandmasters in chess, they're all lunatics. None of them have marriages. Few of them have kids. None of them have drinking buddies. None of them will have a night out, just having a hand, playing a friendly hand of poker, finding out who the purse schnook is at the table, because there's always a Rube Goldberg type character there. The rest of us know and fleece. And I was never a great poker player. I wish I was. Love to boast about it. But if I survived into the middle of the game and got out with very modest losses below $100, I felt it was a successful evening, that kind of thing. But you know who the schnooks are. And the great American leaders, there's a major book to be written on this in political science, Poker and the Rise of the United States, starting with Hamilton Fish and Abraham Lincoln, and going through Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, the great, and Kennedy, of course. The great American presidents were all great poker players. So was Nixon. I don't know for sure about Ronald Reagan. I think he would have probably cleaned the house on every occasion because he looked so innocent and, oh, gee whiz. And so he was always underestimated. Just as President Trump is always underestimated because of his bluster and bluff in public. This is a man who inherited hundreds of millions of dollars, turned it into fortunes worth billions of dollars, declared bankruptcy on at least 3 occasions, and came back successfully from every one of them, and won outright victory in a system biased against him as President of the United States 2 occasions. Now he's very old now, 78, 79. No doubt he's not at his best anymore. But again, as with Putin, as with Harry Truman, don't underestimate them. If I may, a story about Truman that was told by one of his first directors of Central Intelligence and heads of the CIA, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, I think it was, and who was not an uncritical admirer of Truman, to put it mildly. And he's talking about some other critics of Truman who are calling Truman a hick, an idiot, a simplistic Midwestern fool, this, that, and the other. What did Admiral Hillenkotter, who had served under him, say? Look, on the one hand, this is a man who went bankrupt nearly 30 years ago as a haberdasher, as a seller of hats. He ran a hat store in Kansas City with his partner, right? And they went bankrupt after a few months because he didn't know how to position a hat attractively in a window. He couldn't even do that. And then he delivers the punchline. But it's a mistake to underestimate him. Here is President Trump, who can act like an utter buffoon in public and does repeatedly, and can do some appalling things too. He does a U-turn on the Alaska summit with Putin within 48 hours of coming out of it. But look at what he has achieved also in his life. And you have all these writers in the big, great New York Times lecturing him, he declared bankruptcy 2 or 3 times. How can a man who declared bankruptcy become president of the United States? Even in 2016, I was telling every American and every European analyst who would listen to me, which was not many, but there were a few, so I made a living from it. What I said to them was, but the United States government has been bankrupt already for 50 years since Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War. Isn't that exactly, therefore, what we need? A president who has experience of bankruptcy and knows how to handle it and liquidate it and come back from it? That's exactly what we need, you damn ignorant fools. And look at the New York Times. They had the richest news market in the world. And unlike you, who have kept your head above water in a much smaller pond, but you know how to swim, Sean, they went out of money. They were owned by the Ox family for 150 years, but who owes them today? And you talk to any liberal Democrat in New York City or Washington, D.C., and they were all piss ignorant of this, and they want to remember it. It is the Mexican government that owns the New York Times. To be precise, it is the man who owns the Mexican government. It is Carlos Slim, the great third world smartphone hyper tycoon who was worth at least $3 or $4 billion and probably much, much more than that. And he actually got most of his money honestly, and well, he raised the standard of living of farmers and agrarian people throughout the developing world. Because with only when smartphones came along could any little local hick farmer from Oklahoma to Saskatchewan to central Brazil to India and China dial his cell phone or her cell phone and see what the market rates were in Shanghai, in Sao Paulo, in New York, in Toronto, in Montreal. And we have been in a world, thank God, for 25 and 30 years now, where thanks to Carlos Slim, that information has been, crucial economic information has been democratized for billions of people. But he owns the New York Times. The Ox do not, Sulzbergers do not own the New York Times. The Jews no longer own the New York Times. They work for it, and being liberal New York Jews, they're so stupid they don't even realize who they really work for. They don't even realize it. You know, I come from Ireland, which is a tiny country, and I grew up there. And I didn't just come from Ireland. I grew up in a corner of Ireland. Maybe it's like Alberta. Is Alberta the same as living in Ontario or even Quebec? Of course it isn't. Right? You know that, but does anyone south of the border know that? I assume, from what I've seen, people in Toronto and Montreal have and Quebec City and Ottawa have much higher IQs than we have in the great metropolitan, sophisticated intellectual centers of the East Coast here in the United States. Not that we set the bar high, as you know, we set the bar very low. But you have to understand this difference. I mean, for you, it's second nature. You grew up in it. So did I. The huge advantage we both have, as another friend of mine, you may be familiar with him, Pele Neroth Taylor. He and I have just, incidentally, if I can pitch it here, we've just launched our own modest podcast, The Pele and Martin Show. So we're up to 5 episodes now. We have quite a few years to go to match your stellar record, but we'll try. And anytime you want to be our guest, you know, you could not be more welcome. But Pele made the point in the last one we did. He's from Sweden. I'm from Northern Ireland. And I was always looking at Washington and American journalism as an outsider. And he was always an outsider and made to remember it, of course, in London journalism. And you see where all the blind spots are. And it's enormous. I mean, nobody in America takes Canada seriously, but you shouldn't feel bad up there or in Alberta, because nobody in America to this day takes all of Latin America seriously. After I had put in 5 years covering the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and the Washington Times, the paper's editor said, and I got my first 2 Pulitzer Prize nominations. I would later get a third. They said, write your own ticket, Marty. What would you like to do next? I had no hesitation. I wanted to visit Buenos Aires. I wanted to see the great archaeological sites and culture of Mexico. I adore Mexican cuisine. I wanted to visit Tiahuanaco, up in the Andes, the great Inca cities. So I said, I want to cover Latin America. We didn't have even the second big main newspaper based in Washington, D.C., we had no Latin American coverage at that point. They didn't care. So they said, sure. And I realized soon I'd been too clever by half. Boxed myself into a corner because nobody in my paper or in Washington was interested in Latin America. I kept coming up with these stories, both, you know, solid day-to-day stuff and sometimes better stuff. And nobody was interested. Nobody was interested in the change of government or major issues in Brazil, 200 million people, or Argentina, the great industrial nation of the Southern Hemisphere. Nobody was interested. Or how well Chile was doing in its democracy after the nightmare years under Pinochet, which of course were imposed on it by Nixon and Kissinger. Another story. And there was no money for travel for me to go there. They'd sent me all around the Middle East, all around Europe, all around Eurasia and the Soviet Union. And Russia. I'd had a ball. But there was no money for Latin America because it wasn't regarded as important enough. So eventually my foreign editor at the day, Mark Lerner, bless him, thank God, still going strong now. Significantly, he had the good sense to retire to the Philippines. But Mark told the editors, it wasn't quite true the way he said it, but he knew this was the way to sell it to them. Marty is adrift after all the stuff he did in Eastern Europe. Let's move him to the State Department. And I had another, thanks to Mark, I had another stellar 7-year run covering U.S. foreign policy and, of course, U.S. Russian policy primarily at the State Department from 1992 to 1999 when I moved over to UPI. But first of all, as you know, none of us are God. None of us are always right and always wise. Whenever you find somebody who's that way, who thinks they are, say thank you but no and don't buy the Brooklyn Bridge from them. They're assholes every time. There is one idiot I know in Moscow, an American in Moscow, and he's totally in the hardline Russian camp, and he's American. And the driving force of his life is he regards himself as the greatest American foreign policy genius in history, and Kissinger was a joke. Now, Kissinger had very dark sides to him and inflicted endless suffering on great nations like Bangladesh, Congo, Zaire, Philippines. The list, if not endless, is very, very long. Very dark things in Kissinger. But from an American perspective, an American interest, he knew how to play the Soviet Union. He knew how to play China. And he wasn't obsessed with hating the Chinese or hating the Russians the way Brzezinski was and others. And both the Russians and the Chinese respected Kissinger to the day he died. Kissinger was a major force for preventing world war. And one of the reasons we're in more danger of world war is, although Henry made it to 100, and Biden and his people were so incompetent that they had to ask Henry to go to Beijing to negotiate an easing of financial Chinese pressure on the U.S. Asking a 100-year-old man to fly halfway around the world because your entire administration in Washington is too incompetent and ignorant and stupid and fearful to do it? Think about that. Nobody ever asked the key. Again, I'm a son of Belfast City. As I'm sure you were born in Alberta?
I was born in a small, grew up in Saskatchewan. But I mean, where I sit is right on the border. So it's kind of a funny
but
place.
that's the point. You're a Westerner.
Yes.
You understand this. Plain speaking and common sense. It's not the way you're supposed to be in London or Washington, or I suppose these days in Ottawa either. Right? But it's the way the world ought to be, even when it isn't. And when the world always goes off track from the assholes, you're the people they call on. And sometimes they're even desperate enough to call on the likes of me to set them right. And then they'll send us back to Alberta and Saskatchewan or Northern Ireland or central New Jersey, which are much better places to be anyway. But there you are. Exactly. We're from places that are outsider places where we haven't been taught to totally lie. Where if we see things with our own eyes, we don't come up with fancy intellectual excuses for them. We see the way they really are. You're sitting on the greatest energy bonanza in the Western Hemisphere, and you have a premier who understands this. You have leadership, I think, like President Nazarbayev was when I covered him and when I even worked for him indirectly in Kazakhstan. This was a man who started life as a Communist Party chief, though already the Communist Party was still communist and it was still totalitarian, but it was corrupt, but it was a lot softer than it had been under Stalin. And he made the transition into the wider world. And Kazakhstan has never been a democracy in the Western sense of the word, but it's not been a totalitarian hellhole either. And Nazarbayev, throughout his enormously long presidency, did what Putin has done in Russia and what Khrushchev did in the Soviet Union after Stalin. And Brezhnev tried to do as well. He raised the standard of living of ordinary people dramatically, just as every Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping has done that, and that has been the source of their mandate from heaven, of their own John Locke social contract with their people. just as Premier Smith has been doing that for you folks in Alberta. It is primary politics. Cui bono, as the Romans rightly said. Who benefits? If your own people don't benefit, you have a problem. You're either going to be out of office or you have to turn to the secret police. And as even we found in the Soviet Union, even the secret police can only hold down the lid for so long. Even the secret police.
I'm like, okay, so you got a quarter or 3/4 of a century of staring at different things. And my short time in media, journalism, I have none of these fantasies of mainstream being anything but liars and not telling the truth. I listen to you and I'm like, man, you it feels like you worked in a time of where you went to Russia and you went and saw it and you came back and you reported on it and then you went back over it, and and was there things they wanted you to say? I'm sure there was, and they pushed on you and all the things. Where I sit now, I feel like, how many people listen to this show trust anything any media organization is saying?
I know.
It's a very low number. It is a strange world now of where the New York Times, Fox, CNN, CBC, BBC, just take all the majors. And everybody takes everything with a grain of salt now, like a big giant grain, because they're like, they can't seem to get anything right. They can't seem to do any journalism to paint a full story. It's just like they're trying to paint this narrative and they're sticking to it. And if you contradict it, it's gone. And in your time, Marty, like, was that always the case or has it changed?
It's changed for the worse, but it was already getting that way in my time. Very, very significantly shown. I mean, again, I come from Northern Ireland. I come from North Belfast, not prosperous, respectable South Belfast. My wife came from the wrong side of the tracks in working class industrial New Jersey. And as a result, she understood the wisdom of not what the super wealthy for the past 40 years, prosperous, liberal, well-meaning, but now naive Bruce Springsteen says today, but what he was singing 40 and 45 and even 50 years ago. They've closing down the factory and the railroad tracks. 50 jobs are gone, boys. I'm paraphrasing here, but apologies to the boss. 50 jobs are gone, boys, and they're not coming back. That was my life experience growing up in Belfast. So I go to Oxford, and I have all these intellectually brilliant people who are intellectually much brighter than I am. Because as a result, they see the world there, so they can make up their own fantasies of either liberal democracy or Trotsky theory, or it's all theory, it's all hot air. And they will never see what's in front of their eyes. They didn't come from the industrial north of England. The few people who got in there who did were my friends and still are to this day, whatever their political views are, because they saw what was happening in front of their eyes. When I was a boy, my father, who wasn't in the a shipyard worker, he was a piano tuner. He rose to higher things in life against all odds, but he always existentially saw himself as a piano tuner, which he was, and a radio mechanic. And on Sunday mornings, partly because we could afford to do it because there was no cost involved, my special treat would usually be, as a little boy, my dad would drive me to the Harland and Wolff shipyard, which was still one of the biggest shipyards on earth at that time, and see what they were building. Aircraft carriers, luxury liners, oil tankers. They were still building things. And a few years later, within 10 years, it was all gone. And 20,000 well-paying industrial working-class jobs had gone with it. And within 5 years of all that collapsing, you had civil war in Northern Ireland. And you never hear the economic substructure mentioning. It was free market economics. It was free market economics.
Let's wait. I want to hold here for a second.
Sure.
They take away all the jobs, right? You're talking about well-paying jobs and everything, and then civil war falling right after it. I'm curious because there's been a lot of talk about civil war, and England being at the center point of that, although other places as well. Do you think that's possible? Well, I mean, not possible, because obviously it's possible, but like, do you think civil war in different places is more like red alert, like it is coming because they can't change course fast enough, or is nothing that imminent?
It's imminent. It may not happen. I pray it will not happen. One thing you find with, dramatic prophets in the media, they either lie and are totally false. In Britain, the two great cases of this in my time were Enoch Powell and Nigel Farage. Just leave the European Union and you will prosper mightily. We could go into that on another occasion if you like. It was a lie, of course. They might have done a bit better, but they didn't even do that. He doesn't have a clue, and he's going to become Prime Minister of Britain, and he's going to fail catastrophically. I do predict that right now, based on the polls. I mean, those are my crystal balls. In America, I look at at John Zogby's polls for the last 25 years, and I've known him a little. I knew his brother James, a Middle East activist and analyst. Brilliant, both of them fine men and brilliant men, and most important of all, fearless men. An honest man. You can disagree with them as much as you like, and I often have, but their data is always impeccable. Here we are, a deeply divided country. If, God forbid, the assassination attempt on President Trump before he won the election had succeeded in Butler, Pennsylvania, before the election, I think it was July of 2024, we could have had civil war right then. We could have. It could still come. It could flare from the right. It could flare from the left. I've written books on this. I'll pitch one of them here for your viewers. And please pick it up yourself and recommend it. I need the sale. And I need a publisher for my new edition. I had to publish it myself in Kindle, and I need to get it out in a published version. 140 American and British publishers turned it down. Cycles of Change. Published in 2015. I'd actually had the idea 15 years before. I had the most, not even, they weren't the evil, but the most stupid and incompetent editors at major media outlets who kept me churning it, making it longer and longer, and then got fired themselves. Another story. But Cycles of Change analyzes the history of the United States of America as 7 distinct periods when the politics, economics, sociology, and most of all the philosophy and the way not just leaders, but ordinary people think in America. There has not been one single America. There have been 7 Americas. And I'll list them now. There's been the America of Thomas Jefferson, opening the borders and of states' rights. There has been the much more aggressive era of Andrew Jackson, which led to the Civil War, which was basically stealing the entire continent from the Mexicans and enslaving the Indians and imposing the native peoples and imposing ethnic cleansing on them. That was the Second America. Then you had the post-Lincoln America, industrial America, when America, along with Germany, is the new two giant superpowers of industry and power and concentration of capitalist wealth. Then you have kinder, gentler capitalism, and it isn't really, but it claims to be. The progressive era, from Theodore Roosevelt through to the Great Depression, through Hoover. And that's a very dangerous America, because it's full of well-meaning idiots who think that the American solutions can be imposed on the rest of the world and happiness will immediately follow. Woodrow Wilson. Didn't happen that way. It was a catastrophe for Europe when America imposed its wisdom on Europe after World War I rather than the other way around. But then you have what I would regard as the best of the eras. Franklin Roosevelt's era, the New Deal era. Social democratic America from 1932 to 1968. Plenty of things go wrong. They fight the Cold War. The CIA becomes an evil and dangerous state within a state. President Kennedy is assassinated, an event which is really a coup of the greatest significance and darkness. You could say, and then you have what Nixon failed to achieve, but Reagan did. You have America as the hyperpower, winning the Cold War, and again doing what it did so disastrously in 1919 with Woodrow Wilson, imposing its own simplistic ideas of democracy and capitalism and business and free markets on the rest of the world. and making things worse rather than better, all the while being convinced they're making things better. And that era is running out of steam now. It is also the era of free market, open border economics, which is not sustainable in the long run. The way and you must have scores of thousands of business schools across the United States of America. And I'm sure it's the same in Canada. On our side of the border, every one of those business schools teaches the wisdom of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and that government must never be involved in the free market, which is a straight lie, because even when it is not involved, it is therefore by de facto involved in not protecting its own national interests when other countries do, right? But above all else, you don't have tariff protections, you don't have control over what you sell to the world, or more importantly, what you import from the world. And everyone who tries to follow the national interest, the first great champions of this in the Western Hemisphere was Abraham Lincoln and his successors. And Britain only goes back, becomes the most prosperous trading power in human history around the whole world for 200 years, from 1650 to 1850, because of the Navigation Acts and other legislation passed by Oliver Cromwell and maintained by very sensible oligarchs with their own vested interests after that. And on the basis of this strength, they become the most advanced industrial power in the world and the wealthiest financial power in the world, just as America became after them and just as China has become today. Notice I don't say as China is becoming. China already is. Therefore, it makes enormous sense, even in the interests of the province of Alberta, to have as close and warm ties with China and to have as much Chinese protective influence in Alberta as you can possibly get in both Edmonton and Calgary. Because that may be of crucial importance in preventing future governments in Ottawa from trying to take advantage of or dismantle your own interests and power structure in Alberta, in Calgary and Edmonton.
If I was going to have a thought set here today, Alberta getting closer ties with China was not on my bingo card.
Wasn't on mine either, but it led me there, and it's led you there too. This is not a bad thing. It is not a bad thing. The Chinese are very interested in the long term, just as the British were before them. The Chinese have institutes studying the culture of Iceland, and they have language and culture experts on Iceland. Why? How many people live in Iceland? But Iceland is strategic. But only if you're interested in strategically controlling the North Atlantic Ocean. But you have the United States and you have Europe. And you have, for that matter, you have the Russian Navy. The Chinese aren't going to take over the North Atlantic Ocean today or tomorrow or at the beginning of 2026. Of course they're not. But how far ahead are they looking? How far ahead do we need to look? And when you're from small countries, tiny countries, like Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland or the province of Alberta, or for that matter, the great state of New Jersey, we're about to elect our own governor tomorrow. I know who I'm voting for, but since I think the other person is much more likely to either win or steal the election, I'd better not say it publicly, even to you. But exactly. But again, I come from Northern Ireland. There's an old joke. I don't. Hopefully, you're immune to it in Canada, but it certainly applies alas now in America. Why is there so much religion in Northern Ireland? Why are we all so devoutly Protestant and Catholic? Why do we take our religion so much seriously than people in England do or in big American cities do? Very simple reason. We know as a matter of record and fact that every 5 years the dead rise from the graves and vote. Elections are fixed every 5 years. You know, all these people who died in the previous 5 years, their votes are still recorded. In American cities, we're just across the state line from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a very, typically of an American state, has a hugely conservative countryside and deeply democratic and liberal inner cities, especially in Philadelphia. But in an inner city, as I saw even when the election results were coming in from honest elections in Britain and Ireland when I was a boy, the returns come when they're counted. Usually they should come first from the inner cities and then later from the countryside, because it takes longer to bring in and correlate, even in these electronic days, the rural vote. But that never happens anymore in American elections. It's always the big cities, LA and New York and Philadelphia, very much Philadelphia, and Baltimore in Maryland, who are the last to return the results. Why is that? Because only after the rural results are in do the big party bosses, especially the Democratic Party bosses in the big cities, know how many votes they need to manufacture to plausibly win the election. Simple. And of course, you have Republican states where it can go in the other direction because everybody does it.
Marty, you're almost positioning. I don't know if I'm catching this the right way. So
I think you probably are. Go on.
Well, you're positioning the United States as the most corrupt, right? You're talking about your elections, and certainly, I understand. But then what you were saying before that was that China has this vision. They're looking out 100 years. So why are they starting to study these places? Well, because they have a plan. They have 1 billion people. They have all these things they're going to start to exert their influence on. And so they want to understand these cultures and places so that they can best use them, work with them. I don't know the word. And if you go back to what the British used to do, they were roughly the same way. Now, it's brutal. It comes down to, like you've rattled off all the bad things, and yet China looks to be doing the same thing. So why is it painted in such a different light if it's the same tactic the British Empire used?
Oh, Freud tells us that whenever someone is guilty of not just obviously monstrous crimes like murder or rape or incest or even doing a Bernie Madoff and stealing the savings of millions of people and making them vanish. But whenever people, and we've all seen it, and clearly you must have too, when you see cruelty in individual families, husbands or wives being cruel to each other, or together being cruel to their children, or children being cruel to their parents, anything, right? What does the guilty party always do? Dr. Freud told us this 120, 130 years ago. They put the blame on the innocent party. They can't face their own guilt. They have to feel they are so noble. At the very same, I did a podcast for a seminar online for our mutual friend Matt Ehret and his partner, wife Cynthia Chung, also in Canada, of course. You see, with all the problems you have up there from Montreal to Alberta, you folks are still, so far, thank God, shining lights of freedom of expression and hope. You are. And what Freud tells us, today it's called gaslighting. He called it projection. And that's what the British Empire always did. And they're doing it again in Ukraine today. All those of us who want to end the hideous slaughter of the poor Ukrainian people. 1.8 million dead minimum so far, and the idea that they have a happy democracy under Zelensky, when in fact it's a criminal state in which human trafficking and child trafficking and enslavement and drug trafficking spreading around the world, and money laundering is carried out with total impunity and the total support of the West. It also helps to have supranational outfits like the European Union and NATO or other ones covering your back. Because even now, it's easier to hold individual governments accountable. You at least have been spurred from Mrs. Freeland, the granddaughter of a genuine Nazi war criminal who visited Auschwitz, becoming your prime minister, at least for now. She may get there yet. I'm Irish. What does that mean, apart from playing poker? It means we don't suffer under the delusion that the future is going to be automatically better or automatically rational, which the English, bless them, like the Germans, people of today are much more sensible, I think, very much more sensible. But the English people of today are like the Germans were up to Hitler and made them vulnerable to Hitler. It's the delusion of Immanuel Kant. It's the delusion that the world needs to be tidy and rational and pure and neat, and that there's only ever upward and onward progress. When I was even at school, before I even went to university, I was taught by my teachers, and they were good British imperial patriots. They weren't out to brainwash me. They believed it totally themselves, and I believed it with them. We all believed it together. That the course of human history was a rise towards democratic liberal perfection, which Britain in the 1950s and 60s had finally reached. And all the rest of the world had to do was look at how perfect and virtuous and beautiful we were in Britain. Even more dangerously, the East Coast liberal establishment had that view in America. That's why they bombed the entirety out of Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, especially Cambodia, of course, because they were saving them. They felt morally justified in doing it. That's the problem. My first real encounter with history, apart from the rioting on the streets of my native Belfast, which came first, of course, was when I was a 19-year-old student, brand new in Oxford University, and everybody made fun of my thick Irish accent. It was much more like that in those days than it is today, you must understand, since my dad was a Cork man. It became a little bit more Americanized and soothing. Maybe you would say Canadianized or Canarchized, what your correct term is, since then. But I was shocked and horrified, and idealist not to occur, about what was clearly happening to the poor Igbo peoples in the secessionist state of Biafra in Nigeria. And it wasn't hard to learn, because there was an open dissident British press even in those days, that British government and financial policies and interests and oil interests were at the heart of it all. And then I'm at Oxford, and the foreign secretary of the day, a British Secretary of State, Michael Stewart, totally forgotten individual today, and he should not be. He should have been hanged as a war criminal, just the way Goering would have been if he hadn't committed suicide. There's this great new movie coming out called Nuremberg. We're not going to see a movie called Biafra or London about the trial of Harold Wilson and his foreign secretary for totally supporting the genocidal extermination of the Igbo people, and 3 million of them died, 1 million of them children starved to death as a direct British policies. It's monstrous. And I asked the foreign secretary directly responsible at age 19 and it changed my life, not just the way I looked at things, but without realizing it, of course, it put me on the record of the British security services as a dangerous subversive. Now, I never wanted to join the British security or be a spy or a counter spy or whatever. So you could say, in a way, it didn't really change my life. But I was clearly marked by them at that point, even at age 19. But I asked him, Mr. Stewart, why are you doing this? And I was expecting him to scream abuse at me and be a Nazi and be a bully, a thug, And he floored me. He wasn't like that at all. Not at all, Sean. He was sweet. He was understanding. He was compassionate. He was nice. And it wasn't an act. Oh, Mr. Sieff, he said, it's been such an agonizing policy. I lose sleep at night over it, but it is the only moral thing we can do. If we do not do it, all the borders of Africa, we'll set a precedent for all the independent state borders of Africa to go, and there will be far worse bloodshed and suffering if we do that than if we support the integrity of the Nigerian state. Now, of course, he was an ignorant, full of himself little asshole. It wasn't true. But he wanted it to be true. He wanted it to be true. But I was expecting to meet Heinrich Himmler. I was expecting to meet an NKVD executioner. Sure, I killed 10,000 people with bullets in the back of their heads, and I'm proud of it. It was for communism. It was for a better world. What the F are you going to do about it, right? He wasn't like that at all. He was a meek, mild-mannered, imagined he was Christian. He wasn't, of course. He was killing 3 million Christians. But he imagined he was Christian. He imagined he was progressive. And above all else, he knew he was moral. And all the assholes in London, you find them in Israel too, not just, Israeli liberals will condemn Netanyahu quite correctly for what he's done in Gaza. But they won't say a word about what NATO and Britain are doing to send the Ukrainian people to their deaths by giving them all these weapons that they don't know how to use, that won't work anyway. And all they're doing is cynically sending them to their deaths. According to Colonel Douglas McGregor, one of our most brilliant military analysts here, the death ratio is 17 Ukrainian soldiers to 1 Russian who has been killed. Now, that's not a good deal. It's certainly not a good deal for the poor Ukrainians.
History would tell us that it used to be 20 Russians for every dead German, or roughly. It was opposite, is all.
Exactly. And that's the anti-Russian stereotype you still see. There are actually first-class historical videos I've seen, and there are wonderful professors of history, like Professor Robert Citano, Sicilian-American name, so I apologize for mispronouncing it, Citino, who one of the great historians of the Eastern Front of World War II, who point out that far from being thuggish incompetence, which is the big lie the Nazi generals who we loved and embraced when we were building NATO in the West, the lie that we swallowed from them, the Nazis lost the war. For all the dead Russians they'd slaughtered, most of them who were helpless, defenseless civilians anyway, there is no German militarism anymore. There hasn't been in 80 years. Why? Because all the German militarists were killed. They were slaughtered. You talked before, and it's a recurrent theme with you, and with me, of course, the reporters who had skin in the game, who had been there, had seen with their own eyes. The New York Times was still a great newspaper through World War II. Their main military correspondent was a man called Harrison Salisbury, who was so good that he predicted the split between the Soviet Union and Communist China 10 years before it happened, and at least 12 years before the CIA woke up to it. And all you had to do was read him in the New York Times. That's how good the New York Times in those days was, and how good Harrison Salisbury was. Harrison Salisbury said, "I saw German militarism die. It did not die because of the superiority of Western ideas and democracy. It did not die because the Russians sacrificed 100 million men for every one dead German, or ridiculous talk like that. It died because the Russians were better soldiers and had far better generals and ran their war vastly superiorly, not just to Hitler, but to all the German generals who tried to blame it on Hitler afterwards and were equally culpable." And then he delivers the punchline, which every sweet, meek, mild, liberal American and British kumbaya worshipper hates. German militarism died with a Tommy gun burst in the belly of every single German soldier. That wasn't a macho thug off the streets of my native Belfast talking. It wasn't an unsophisticated cowboy from Alberta or Saskatchewan like you talking. It was the chief foreign correspondent of the New York Times, when that still counted for something, when he was talking. And why was he talking that way? Because, like you said, Sean, he'd seen it with his own eyes.
If I come all the way back, China.
Sure.
They're looking out, I think we can safely assume 100 years, right? I think that is one of the things that China does very differently than let's say Canada or somebody especially with short voting cycles, right? And they have a vision of where the world is heading. They're studying all these different things. They're starting to influence. They're starting to do a bunch of different things on the way they want change to happen. You see that as being good?
It's superior to the way we are now. Yes, I do see it as being good. Now, it's not totally always good. Our line, which in the 1980s and 90s, when I was new in America and young, and the world seemed to be going that way, was our way is superior to their way because they're locked into 5-year plans and 10 years plans, like the communists loved, and the Chinese still do. All their Politburo is trained as engineers. There's a great Canadian Chinese scholar I've recently been reading. He's been around a while, a wonderful man, clearly, Daniel Yang. Wang, W-A-N-G, Dan Wang. And he's written a new book called Breakthrough, right? Which, in the globalist way of things, a very good friend of mine in the Middle East, of all places, recommended to me first, and I wouldn't have known about it otherwise. And he believes that America is a lawyer-obsessed society, and the lawyers have choked all chance for change and growth and quick adaptability in society. Whereas China, he says, is what America was 100 and 150 years ago. It is an engineer's society. They do what we did up to 1970. They build things. They build roads. They build airports. They build dams. They have build electrical generating power. They develop fusion systems that actually work. They do more renewable technology than anybody else in the world. They are practical. And he makes the point that there are some advantages to a lawyerly society too, but there are huge disadvantages. And he makes a key point. An engineer society raises the standard of living of everybody because they bring electrification and television and broadband communication, such as you flourish on, even to Northern Ireland and Alberta and Saskatchewan. They help, ultimately, they raise up everybody. Under the New Deal, they finally electrified rural America. Could have been done 40 years before with the technology that was available, but the big city interests weren't, business interests weren't interested, so it had to wait for the New Deal. But it was done, and America never looked back. Never looked back, right? But a lawyerly society ultimately only protects the wealthy and the rich, because they can hire far more lawyers and better lawyers to jam up the process. And this happens. And another key factor is something, as you know, our dear friend Matt Ehret is very into, and I think your excellent Premier and your provincial government rightly have to desperately fight too. And that is the ghastly fairy tale myth of environmentalism, which is used to smother and destroy all independent economic growth and prosperity. Oil is essential, as I said before, not just for cheap energy to heat your homes or power your cars and your pickup trucks. Oil is essential for the food you eat, because all the food you eat is grown, even in Canada and certainly in the United States. It is not grown sweetly and organically. It cannot be. To feed 7 billion human beings, better than 1 billion human beings ate 200 years ago, which is dramatically the case, you need fertilizer. And you need artificial fertilizer, because all the natural fertilizer from bird droppings and guano down the length of Chile was used up 120 years ago. And everybody expected Malthusian famine then. And what prevented it? 2 German chemists, Karl Bosch, the great engineer, and the genius research chemist, and they were a partnership, they worked incredibly well together, Fritz Haber, who both won the Nobel Prize for chemistry for the first time ever being able to pull nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it by chemical processes into nitrate fertilizer. And since 80% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, that means it is limitless in realistic terms. We are not running out of nitrogen, but we need oil for the huge inputs of oil for the Haber-Bosch process. And if it broke down tomorrow, 3/4 of maybe 80% of the people in China and India and much of the rest of the world would starve. Of the 7 billion to 8 billion, I think it's nearly 8 billion now human beings alive in this world, 5.5 billion of them at least live and have a hope of life and of decent life because of the 2 obscure German chemists who lived 120 years ago. the Haber-Bosch process. But what this means is that Alberta's oil is never going to go out of fashion. Even if we could have solar power magnificently on demand tomorrow. And it's destroying the economies of California and Australia, as you know, as we speak. You know this. You're a leading expert on this in the media. And you know how few people in the media, even on our side of the fence, know anything about this whatsoever. Know nothing about it whatsoever. Australia and California going bankrupt with soaring energy costs. That's like communism starving all those poor people in Ukraine to death in what was then and should be again the breadbasket of the world. The breadbasket of the world. Whatever else you say against Perón and his fascists in Argentina, and I would say a lot against them, but at least the Argentinian people never starved when Perón and his successors were in power. They weren't that stupid. But the communists were in Ukraine, and all these liberal, idealistic, environmental green governments are in both Australia and, most of all, as you know, in California. How long before California comes pleading to Alberta, oh, bail us out, please?
Well, that's if the Canadian Liberal government allows it, because the Canadian Liberal government
Yes,
is trying to move us away from oil.
exactly. Exactly. And Mrs. Freeland may be gone for the moment, but the liberalism and the greenism and the idiocy are still there. Look, in 2 world wars, the British naval blockade in World War I, revolution after World War I, hundreds of thousands of tons of British bombs dropped on the Ruhr in World War II, Germany occupied by the Soviets from the east and by the US and Britain from the west. And they all failed to destroy the great industries of the Ruhr that had been built in the 1840s and 50s. Who destroyed them? You just gave us the answer. The green liberals of Berlin and Brussels destroyed them. Mrs. Merkel destroyed them. To appraise all these green environmental policies, the collapse of American prosperity, the plunging of hundreds of millions of Americans into economic misery really gets worse from Bill Clinton and the ghastly little Bush, George Bush Jr., George W. Bush, when they let China into the World Trade Organization. And this is not an anti-Chinese rant. The Chinese morally follow their own national interests and the interests of their people first. China could have risen to all the prosperity it has, and the Americans didn't have to cut their own throats to do it. But they did it because they worshiped the false gods of free trade, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, which is taught in all their business schools, with no rejoinder or criticism permitted or allowed, as you know, and also because of the environmental crap. And when does the environmental crap take over American policy and start choking the American economy and strangling it to death? Why, under that great conservative, patriotic Richard M. Nixon, who was a totally piss-ignorant asshole when it came to anything about industry or business or economics whatsoever. But of course, it's a classic example of the Kruger-Dunning effect. He thought he was a genius. Whenever you come across people who think they are geniuses, hell no. Look, I've had 1 or 2 people who don't know me who've said, oh, the way you talk, you're a genius. God forbid. You know, whether you cross yourself a Catholic or Orthodox, either way. No, and I don't want to be, because they're all assholes. They're all assholes. What I would like to be is a kid off the streets of Belfast, who saw what was in front of his eyes and had enough wit to listen to people who knew what they were talking about. I have more to learn from you than you have from me, because you've been covering these issues for so long and so well. And I hope you'll have me back, not just to rant and rave, which you've let me do, but to listen to you.
Well, I tell you what, you and Pelly, you invite me on. I'll come. I'll come and talk some things Canada with you too.
Do you have Pelly's email?
I do. Yep.
Well, there we are. I'll get the circular email going right away. He'll love it. I mean, one thing I learned from the neoconservatives in Washington, whom I have loathed, despised for 40 years and more. And one of my great career mistakes was never taking them seriously. I never thought people who were such simplistic idiots could end up rising to such power in the world. But they always have, they're like the Freemasons. They always scratch each other's backs. And we're the good guys. We need to scratch each other's backs too and appear in each other's shows, you know? That's the lesson, the one good lesson I think I took from the neocons. Help your friends and always call out for them to help you. Because that's all they ever did. They didn't have any arguments. They didn't have any facts. They didn't have any integrity. They're not lovable. They're not honest. Ooh.
Martin, appreciate you coming on the show, and well, lots of thoughts there in an Irishman's rant.
Absolutely. What can I say? I become more green the older I get. What can I say? And look, with your name, obviously, you're one too, Sean.
One what?
You're Irish.
No, I'm definitely not.
Wow. Well, with your name, you obviously have parents who married the Irish. What can I say?
Well, thanks again, Martin, for coming on and sharing some thoughts.